There was a time when utility bills were so boring, no one talked about them. No apps, no alerts, no monthly guessing game. You paid them, folded the paper, and forgot they existed. Today, opening a utility bill feels different. Not because you're careless, not because you don't budget, and not because you suddenly forgot how money works. It feels different because something essential has become unstable. You feel it before you read the number, that quiet moment of tension, that pause where you're already adjusting the rest of your month in your head. We're told this is normal, that this is just inflation, just the cost of modern life. But normal things don't demand this kind of attention. For decades in this country, utility bills were predictable, not cheap, predictable, and that predictability mattered more than most people realize. It meant the lights, the heat, the water, basic parts of life stayed in the background where they belonged. When boring systems work, life feels manageable. When they disappear, anxiety takes their place, and stability doesn't vanish by accident. This isn't a story about nostalgia, and it's not about blaming anyone. It's about understanding how something so ordinary, so uneventful it barely registered, quietly changed, and why that change affects almost every household today. To understand where that certainty went, we have to go back to when boring was the goal. That's where this story begins. When we say utility bills used to be boring, it's important to be precise about what that meant. Boring didn't mean cheap, and it didn't mean people didn't notice money. It meant the numbers made sense. For most of the mid-20th century, American families knew roughly what their utility bills were going to be before the envelope ever arrived, not because they were guessing, because month after month, year after year, the bills stayed within a narrow, understandable range. There were seasonal changes, of course. Heating cost more in the winter, electricity nudged up in the summer, but those changes followed patterns people understood. Nothing came out of nowhere. Utilities were treated like infrastructure, not a moving target. The system was built around reliability. Rates changed slowly. Charges were simple. Most bills could be understood at a glance. And because of that, families didn't have to think about them very much. Utility costs were a known number in the household budget. They didn't require constant monitoring. They didn't demand attention. They didn't force decisions. You didn't plan your month around your electric bill. You planned your life knowing it was handled. That predictability did something subtle but powerful. It freed up mental space. When basic systems are stable, people don't feel wealthy, but they do feel grounded. Life feels organized, manageable, ordinary in the best possible way. And for a long time, that quiet stability was the norm. Because utility bills were predictable, families didn't build their lives around them. They built their lives past them. Utilities were part of the background math. You accounted for them once, and then you moved on. They didn't get their own category of worry. They didn't interrupt decisions about groceries, clothes, or gas. Most households had a mental number, not written down, not tracked daily, just known. This much for electricity, that much for heat. Water was barely a conversation. And because those numbers held steady, people trusted them. Parents didn't sit at the kitchen table recalculating the month because the power bill came in higher than expected. They didn't delay other payments just to see what happens next month. They didn't need to. The bill arrived, it matched expectations, it got paid. That routine mattered. It meant kids grew up in homes where basic necessities weren't a source of visible stress, where the lights being on didn't feel conditional, where heat in the winter wasn't something that had to be mentally negotiated. Utilities weren't something you talked about unless something broke. And that's the key difference. When systems work, they disappear from conversation. When they don't, they dominate it. The predictability of utility bills didn't make families rich, but it made them feel secure enough to focus on everything else. That sense of quiet control didn't come from luck. It came from how the system was built.
Compare that to how utility bills feel today. The bill still shows up every month, but the experience is completely different. You don't just open it, you study it. There are new charges, adjustments, fees with names that don't explain much, numbers that don't line up with how the month actually felt. And even when you use less, the bill doesn't always reflect it. So you check again. You log into an account. You scroll through charts. You look at daily usage, peak hours, off-peak hours, trying to understand how something so basic became so complicated. And all of that happens before the bill is even paid. What used to be a known number is now a moving target. Some months are manageable. Others arrive like a surprise. And because you don't trust the next bill, you start planning around uncertainty instead of stability. You leave room in your budget just in case. You hesitate on other expenses. You adjust after the fact. It's not just about the money. It's about the attention. Utilities now compete with everything else for mental space. They demand tracking. They demand explanations. They demand emotional energy. Even when you're doing everything right, the system doesn't feel settled. That's the shift most people can feel but struggle to name. The bills didn't just get higher, they got unpredictable. And once something essential becomes unpredictable, it stops feeling like infrastructure. It starts feeling like risk.
This shift didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a single year when utility bills suddenly stopped being boring. No headline, no announcement, no moment where families were told this is going to feel different now. It happened gradually. Over time, utilities stopped being treated purely as public infrastructure and started being treated as market products. Rates became more complex, pricing models multiplied, new variables were introduced, some tied to demand, some to fuel costs, some to systems most households never see. On paper, it was all logical. In practice, it changed the relationship. Instead of paying for a service designed around reliability, families were now exposed to fluctuations they couldn't control. Costs were no longer shaped only by usage, but by timing, conditions, and external pressures that had nothing to do with daily life. And here's the important part. Most people didn't notice right away. Bills crept up slowly. Complexity arrived quietly. One extra line item, one new explanation, one new chart that promised transparency but delivered confusion. Utilities didn't become unstable all at once. They became less predictable, one small change at a time. Families adjusted, then adjusted again, until one day the bill stopped matching expectations. And once expectations break, trust goes with them. That's when people started checking usage more often. That's when budgeting stopped feeling settled. That's when a basic necessity became something you had to manage instead of something you could rely on. The system didn't collapse, it transformed. And in that transformation, something subtle but important was lost. The assumption that essential services would behave consistently from one month to the next.
Here's the part that often gets missed. The past wasn't defined by things being cheap. It was defined by things being stable. People today often look back and focus on lower prices, but price alone was never the real advantage. Stability was. Knowing what was coming mattered more than paying the absolute minimum. A utility bill that's slightly higher but predictable allows a household to plan. It allows people to make decisions with confidence. It lets the rest of life fall into place. Instability does the opposite. Even when the average cost doesn't explode, uncertainty acts like a tax. It forces caution. It creates hesitation. It makes people hold back, not because they're irresponsible, but because they don't trust the next bill. That's why modern utility stress feels heavier than the numbers alone suggest. When a family doesn't know what their bill will be, they don't just worry about electricity or heat, they worry about everything else that depends on that money. Groceries, gas, small repairs, saving anything at all. Stability creates breathing room. Instability consumes it. In earlier decades, utility costs were boring enough to fade into the background. That allowed households to focus on things that actually improved life: education, savings, maintenance, rest. Today, even financially careful people feel stretched, not because they're spending wildly, but because too many essential costs now move without warning. The problem isn't simply what utilities cost, it's that they stopped behaving like something you could trust. Utility bills don't exist in isolation anymore. That's what makes the instability feel heavier now than it ever did before. In the past, utilities were one fixed part of a fairly simple financial picture. Today, they compete with a growing list of other obligations that didn't exist or barely registered just a few decades ago. Rent or mortgages are higher and less flexible. Insurance takes a larger bite. Every month is already crowded with commitments. So when a utility bill comes in higher than expected, it doesn't just create inconvenience, it creates a chain reaction. Plans get delayed, budgets get reshuffled, small decisions suddenly carry more weight. And because so many expenses are already locked in, there's nowhere easy to make up the difference. You can't negotiate the bill, you can't push it to next month, you just absorb it. That's why even modest increases feel exhausting. It's not that people are weaker or less disciplined, it's that the margin for error has disappeared. The gap that once existed between paydays, between obligations, has been squeezed tighter and tighter. In that environment, unpredictability hits harder. A system that demands constant attention becomes one more thing to manage in a life that already feels full, and over time, that management turns into fatigue. This is why utility bills now feel personal. They don't just reflect usage, they reflect how little room people have left. And that's a very different experience than simply paying for electricity or heat. It's important to be clear about what this isn't. This isn't about pretending the past was perfect. Homes were smaller, technology was limited, life had its own pressures. But there was something valuable that existed then, and it wasn't comfort or convenience. It was mental quiet. When utility bills were predictable, they didn't occupy thought space. They didn't linger. They didn't demand explanation or strategy. They were handled and forgotten. That mattered. Because when basic systems behave consistently, people feel grounded, even if they're not wealthy. Life feels manageable. Decisions feel proportional. Problems stay in their proper size. Today, that quiet is gone. Utilities are no longer something people simply pay. They're something people watch, track, worry about, talk about. They intrude into conversations they never used to belong in. And that constant attention adds up. Not all stress comes from big crises. Some of it comes from too many small uncertainties stacking up over time. When enough ordinary things become unpredictable, life starts to feel fragile, even when nothing is technically wrong. What we lost wasn't cheap power or free services. We lost the ability to treat basic necessities as settled facts. And that loss reshaped how everyday life feels, month after month. When you look at a utility bill today, it's easy to think the problem is the number at the bottom. But the deeper change happened long before that. What disappeared wasn't affordability alone, it was certainty. For a long time in this country, basic systems were designed to fade into the background. They didn't demand attention. They didn't compete with the rest of life. They worked quietly, consistently, and without surprise. That boring reliability gave people something we rarely talk about now: confidence in the month ahead. Today, that confidence has been replaced with vigilance.
Even when the lights are on and the heat works, there's a feeling that nothing is truly settled. Everything feels provisional, subject to change. And when enough ordinary things start behaving that way, life stops feeling steady, even if you're doing everything right. This story isn't about going backward. It's about understanding what was lost when stability stopped being the goal. Because once you see that, you start noticing it everywhere. And that's where the next part of this story goes.